When the United States left Vietnam in 1963, former National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger contrived to leave with honor. He calculated that the puppet government in Saigon would survive for a sufficient period of time for its fall not to negatively impact American public opinion and its international standing. A war-weary public could stomach an ignoble withdrawal, but not a defeat. 2 years later, the distinction was lost on the world as the American-backed government fell and the United States was forced to evacuate from its embassy. The scenes of helicopters over Saigon were seared into the American consciousness. At the height of its power, the superpower paid the price for its hubristic ambitions. Parallels were hard to avoid when President Biden declared there would be no repeat of Saigon in Afghanistan. However, events took their course and Biden faced a humiliating withdrawal that cost the lives of 13 US soldiers and countless Afghans. A deep crisis now scars his presidency. The Afghan army melted away. The ill-fated Ashraf Ghani decided he would not be another DM, the South Vietnamese leader murdered by his own generals as the Viet Cong advanced. Biden had hoped that the treasures expended on Afghanistan, by some accounts nearly $2 trillion, would buy him some time. Ghani was meant to fight the good fight as US troops withdrew, yet his cowardice got the better of him. Without US air cover, he rightly calculated, the house of cards he had erected in Kabul, a plutocratic liberal mirage, would inevitably crumble. Maybe Biden had hoped for the government to last at least until the commemoration of 9/11, so he could tell his war-weary public that he had done the honourable thing. But scenes of chaos and death at Kabul airport underscored the strategic failure of his administration as they battled to keep up with events. Biden would later narrate that the botched operation was part of his military calculation, yet his words rang hollow. If there was ever a metaphor for a crumbling superpower, it was these final days. This week, I bring together two commentators and analysts to make sense of the regional and international dimension to the crisis. Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. He is an experienced geopolitical analyst. He has been a television reporter and a talk show host for the last 10 years. Sami is a frequent guest on Aljazeera, Sky News, TRT World and other news outlets. Ibrahim Moiz is a writer on South Asia with considerable insight into Afghanistan and Pakistan. He writes for TRT World and other outlets. I brought them together to consider the events of the past 20 years and what next for America and the Muslim world. The Taliban is in the process of forming a government, and its victory against the United States can't be understated. And it's pretty clear that the United States lost the conflict, regardless of how they're trying to package the end of this 20-year war. Brother Ibrahim, can you give us an idea, a brief history of the Taliban and who they are and what they believe in?
So the Taliban are, as their name suggests, they're originally a network of students, like Islamic students, from their core is from southern Afghanistan, but they're based in other parts of Afghanistan as well, and a lot of them were basically politicized or militarized or whatever during the 1980s, during the war against the Soviets. Where quite a lot of them served, sort of as foot soldiers. A few of them were commanders as well. And basically, when the war, after the Soviets were driven out, most of them, they tended to, go back to their homes or, go back to their studies or whatever. They weren't regular fighters. So they mobilized as a group, Taliban with a capital T, in the mid 1990s, and that was largely as a response to sort of the prevailing chaos in at least in southern Afghanistan at that time. And they captured a lot of Afghanistan with relatively little fighting. Part of the reason was that they often allied with one faction against another. And also, a lot of people defected to them as well. And then lastly, they got quite a bit of support from Pakistan over the years, after not the initial period, but definitely afterwards. So these were all factors that helped them take over most of Afghanistan. They captured Kabul in 1996, but they weren't recognized by most countries as the government. And then, in 2001, they were kicked out by the Americans, and they began to mount an insurgency, on and off insurgency. But by the mid 2000s, it was
before
it was very much in
2001.
full
You say
swing.
they formed a government which wasn't recognized in Kandahar in 1996. What was going on in Afghanistan that led to the emergence of the Taliban?
After the Soviet withdrawal, there were a few years where basically both the quote unquote communists and the quote unquote mujahideen, they were basically fighting each other for they were fighting each other sort of in militias, and it was a lot of factionalism. Basically, both sides were very fragmented. So you had certain communists who were allied with certain mujahideen against other coalitions of communists and mujahideen. And after Kabul was taken, basically after the government of Najibullah was overthrown in 1992, this intensified. So that a government that was nominally led by the mujahideen, it was forever fighting at Kabul. And because of that, the rest of the country sort of fragmented. There were sort of localized fighting, or localized fiefdoms of different commanders or different groups. So the upshot was that most of the country was sort of in an anarchic state at the time that the Taliban were formed. And I think that was also one of the reasons that they were able to capture much of it very quickly, because their enemies were not really united. Even afterwards, when the northern militias sort of formed a coalition against them, even that was a very loose coalition, lots of backstabbing, lots of internal fighting going on there. So basically, the fragmentation of the Afghan political and military scene was such that the Taliban were sort of in some areas they were actually welcomed, but in other areas they were at least accepted as an alternative.
Right, and we know from the period of the 1990s and early 2000s that the Taliban ruled a fairly primitive state, and it's clear that the war-torn situation of Afghanistan accounts for the very limited resources the Taliban had in that period. But we also know that the Taliban has been described as adhering to a very austere form of Islam, or a view about Islam which is quite, I suppose that the term is restrictive. It's quite punitive, and it employs quite heavily punishments as a way of keeping authority. I mean, maybe that's just a stereotype that we've been led to acquire. But what accounts for the Taliban ideology, if we can call it that?
So the Taliban, they were not, they were not a specifically like political group, the way that that you can sort of say the Ikhwanul Muslimin or something. Or they were basically students, mostly Deobandi students from the Deoband school of Hanafi thought. And there has been sort of a bit of propaganda about a lot of propaganda about their their restrictiveness and things like that, but it's not, it's based on considerable truth in the sense that there was a lot of it was a very sort of narrow and it was a very narrow and makeshift sort of interpretation, or whatever you want to call it, of Islamic law. It was definitely restrictive. They were not really that brutal compared to like earlier groups I don't know how you want to put it, but they were very restrictive in the sense of, they tended to rule by the stick where other things failed. So for example, actually I had an Afghan friend who basically said that, that they sort of copy pasted, like, Deobandi rules from like the 1800s or from the 1700s, and then tried to apply it to Afghanistan in the year 2000. So obviously there's going to be problems. It wasn't as heavy-handed as people say. I think it was more oppressive more oppressive and more unpopular in places like Kabul or, sort of the big cities of Afghanistan, where obviously, these sorts of basically rural peasant mullahs were, trying to enforce order in a very, sort of punitive sense, or in a very narrow sense. There were definitely exceptions to that, but, as a rule, they were very unpopular in places like Kabul and, in places like Herat, which, it's a very intellectual sort of city. So in these sorts of places, they were definitely unpopular, and that was sort of magnified internationally. I've heard quite a lot of people, compare it to Iran or Saudi Arabia, which, they have sort of similar uses of, punitive law, or whatever you want to call it, versions of Islamic law, but they have much better geopolitical relations. Definitely Saudi Arabia does.
So you've taken us up to 9/11, and the Taliban are forced from power by the Americans. Sami, I wonder if you can come in here. So the war on terror begins after the event in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and beyond, and you now have a movement against the Taliban. Now, there's a lot to be said about the history of the American mission in Afghanistan. But what were the original aims of America? What was it trying to achieve when it invaded Afghanistan?
The original mission of the US was twofold. The first was to satiate an American public that wanted to see blood, that was angry at the fact that the Twin Towers had been destroyed, angry that its fellow citizens had been killed in this attack by an enemy that is far off, from American soil. They were used to seeing wars on TV. They were not used to seeing these things actually happen on their territory. And I think it was a sort of jolt to the system, a jolt to the American psyche, a jolt to the American public, so much so that no president of any standing could have done anything but go to war. And I think that's something from the American perspective that's often underappreciated. This idea that after the Twin Towers, with that death toll, Bush could not go to the American people and say, I'm going to negotiate and discuss with the Taliban. And this is perhaps the counter argument to this idea of, whether the Taliban, had they kicked out Al-Qaeda, whether that would have been enough. But that was the first aim, to satiate that public. It was a political decision, first and foremost, so much so that Donald Rumsfeld was so insistent on it that there was no room for rational debate. And this is why we saw the punishment of an entire region, as opposed to specifically targeting Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, who was being condemned by the Muslim world itself. So instead of just focusing on that, Rumsfeld made it into this big grand war on terror to justify not just going after bin Laden, but also to discipline countries in the region. Remember, in 2001, before 9/11, King Abdullah had threatened to cut ties with the Americans over the video of Muhammad when the Palestinian with his son is hiding behind the box, and the Palestinians, and they go and kill him. If you look at the Washington Post articles, or if you speak to former Saudi advisors, King Abdullah went into a madness and told the Americans that this is it, this is the crossroads. I will cut ties permanently. And Bandar bin Sultan, the then ambassador of Saudi in the US, is on record as saying that King Abdullah scared even me. We in Saudi were convinced he was about to cut ties. And this tension persisted until August. So remember, 9/11 is when everything changes. But until August, King Abdullah is threatening Bush so much so that he forces the Israelis to come up with this peace plan and accept it and offer it to Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat famously goes to King Abdullah, kisses him on the head and tells him, but for you, we would never have been able to come out of this really intense blockade that we were under. But the reason I mention this is that 9/11 was also about disciplining Saudi. And one of the tensions between Saudi and Qatar, to sort of bring everything in, is this leaked tape that was of a conversation between Hamad bin Jassim, the former Qatari prime minister, and Gaddafi, in which Hamid bin Jassim is on record. He doesn't deny that the conversation took place. He says it was taken out of context. But Hamid bin Jassim says to Gaddafi that Saudi is on the list of potential countries that are going to be invaded in a counter to what bin Laden has done and what the Al-Qaeda has done to the US. So the first was about revenge, but the second was also about disciplining the region that was beginning to try to exert itself against the US. And the neocons punished King Abdullah. There is a famous story that I heard once. It was from a gathering with Abdulaziz Tuwajiri, Allah yarahmu, may Allah rest his soul. He is the man considered the architect of King Abdullah's rise to become king. Apparently, it was his idea to establish a national guard and then go negotiate with King Fahd, but that's a different story. Abdulaziz Tuwajiri, apparently the story goes that a journalist went to King Abdullah and said, what can we do in terms of the Palestine-Israel? What's your proposal? Because Saudi proposed the Palestine-Israel deal. And King Abdullah said, write whatever you want. So in terms of the details, write what you wish. The attitude being, just get the Americans off my back, after what bin Laden has done in 9/11.
But we hear that the Americans also added another objective to build a liberal democracy in Afghanistan, to change its political system, and to create economic and social progress. Where did that come into the whole mix of the aims of America? Because it seems to me that this is really where the Americans failed. This was a moving target, but it was impossible for the Americans to achieve this.
I think while that might have been one of the objectives, I don't think it was the main objective. And the reason being, I say that, is that the Americans, when you look at the way that they approach the Middle East or the way they approach the regimes, it doesn't necessarily matter the ideology of the regime insofar as it matters in the way that they align to US interests first and foremost. So if Iran is ready to come to a framework of cooperation with the US, then we'll see an Iran nuclear deal in which they'll agree to respect each other, and there won't be much interest in whether Iran implements liberal democracy or human rights or that kind of thing. I do think, however, that when the Americans do go in, it's natural for them to embark on social engineering. It's natural for them to embark on using aid to disassociate the Afghan population from their culture, from their religion, and to try to embrace the American society. I think there is a sense of American supremacy, this idea that they use the Hollywood films in order to create this image of America as this paradise, so much so that when a US plane lands in Kabul airport and says, I'll take anybody to the US in the spirit of rescuing them from the Taliban, it doesn't matter whether it's Taliban or whoever, you get on that plane and you go to the US. This idea that they created this idea, they tried to create Afghanistan in their image, and they spent much on social engineering, using aid to go to villages to say, look, this is the white American savior coming to feed you, to dig the well, to plant the trees, to build your houses. This is the Americans who are doing good in terms of how they are trying to implement themselves in Afghanistan. But ultimately they failed because they disrespected or they underestimated the extent to which Afghans take pride in their culture and take pride in their religion. And I think one of the things that the Americans did not learn from was that when you look at the Arab Spring, which was right there in 2011, so they had a good 9 years to change their tactics. 2011, you've got Islamist parties or Islamic-leaning parties winning the elections. It's clear that all that secular rule of Bourguiba and Ben Ali in Tunisia did not change the affinity of the Tunisian people, even if you're seeing beaches and less hijab and the like. In Egypt, for all the secularism and Adil Imam films and all of these other Hollywood films coming in, Egypt hasn't changed. Morsi runs for an election, and even in an election in which Morsi and Abu al-Futuh are running together, still they managed to secure a majority. Still Morsi is able to win on a two-round election. So this idea that when the Americans went in, it wasn't so much that they wanted to build a state or a liberal democracy in and of themselves, but rather they did try to impose their values by force. They tried to alter their tactics later by using the hearts and minds. They tried to empower women in their own vision. They tried to dress women in their own vision. But the reality is that the manner in which the US entered, this invasion, this occupation, was a cloud that the Americans could not remove. And therefore, any measure that they took, be it positive or negative, irrespective, it was always seen as a conqueror imposing, as opposed to a bottom-up coaxing of a population to adopt your values. And that's why I think the Taliban were able to storm across Afghanistan and win the required support. I won't say they won support, but they won enough level of support so as to maintain those military gains. When we look now at the Americans, and your question is a very poignant one, at the Americans celebrating women's rights and how they develop women's rights and the like. It's important to put this into reality, which is that the Americans are talking about implementing women's rights and forgetting that they propped up a corrupt government, a corrupt judiciary, a regime that was so bad and so corrupt that the Afghan army did not even feel it was worth defending, that the people did not believe it was worth defending. And this is why I think it's very hollow. And this is why I argue perhaps it wasn't the primary objective. Because when you look at South Korea, and I'll finish on this point, when you look at South Korea, the Americans colonized it for 40 years. But in the 1990s, a liberal democracy did emerge, albeit in a sort of fusion between a Korean-American shape. So if the Americans want to build a state, they can build a state, and South Korea is an example of it, albeit in a very limited terms. None of that happened in Afghanistan, primarily because I don't think it was a key objective, and I think the manner in which the US went in meant anything they did was just an occupier imposing their values on a people who never wanted them there in the first place.
Just touching on what Sami said, he mentioned, sort of this punitive or the sort of, American exceptionalism or supremacism or whatever you want to call it. So they definitely went in with that mindset. And a lot of it was sort of like I mentioned, there were definitely a lot of, sort of exaggerations or misconceptions about the Taliban in Afghanistan. Which is not to say that, that they weren't short of, actual sins or whatever. But a lot of it was, very much exaggerated to the end that, you're saying that, Taliban are, executing women for, stepping out of their homes, things like that, which is like, it wasn't true then, it isn't true now. It was basically just war propaganda that they sort of believed. Basically all the stereotypes or whatever you want to call it of Islam that the sort of Islamophobes or whatever have fanned, they sort of dumped it on the Taliban. They made it so that, the Taliban are one thing, the Afghan society is another thing. And they believe their own hype. To a very large extent, they believe their own hype. They believe their own propaganda. So when they went in, they had a whole bunch of different things going on. Like you mentioned, they did want to, they did sort of want to socially engineer or, sort of politically and socially both mold Afghan society to the norms of the United States. One of the ironies of this was that, that a lot of the commanders that they aligned with, so some of them were former communists, some of them were like, former Islamists of the, of the Ikhwani mold. So for example, Ahmad Shah Massoud's network was, they were basically one branch of the Afghan version of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. What emerged because of these sorts of alliances was an Afghan republic that was, it was portrayed to the outside world as sort of, America sort of liberating Afghanistan from, repressive Islam and whatever. And it was portrayed on the ground as, the same government is trying to portray itself as, we're basically an Islamic republic. We are protecting the rights of Afghanistan. So they were never able to square that circle. And a lot of it was them believing their own propaganda. A lot of it was, their Afghan partners sort of, telling them what they wanted to hear, often for very short-term interests. And like Sami mentioned, there was also this idea that we're going to change Afghan society to the norms of the West. And some of this it even predated the invasion of October 2001. So for example, in February 2001, and even before that, there was a lot of talk in the American media about, the Taliban being an extremely repressive and essentially alien factor in Afghanistan, which wasn't the case. They had some influence from, the Deobandi, from Deobandi seminaries, but they were definitely very much an Afghan faction. And there are a lot of even politicians who were in power after the Americans took over. A lot of them had been part of the Taliban briefly before that. There was a lot of switching sides. There were people who had fought the Taliban before who ended up joining them after 2001. So it was definitely very much part of Afghan society. The Americans, by the time they understood that, it was sort of too late to change their strategy. They did try to change their strategy in the sense of, sort of winning hearts and minds. But again, this was more of a top-down thing. It was an attempt sort of to Americanize Afghanistan. So a lot of the aid was tied into political program. It was basically politicizing things such as aid and development, so that it would help serve the American mission in Afghanistan. The American mission in Afghanistan itself was based on these sort of contradicting ideas. That on one hand we are liberating Afghanistan from radical Islam or whatever you want to call it. On the other hand, they're allying with basically a Muslim Afghan allies. And another thing was that they tended to ally with a lot of the worst sort of segments of Afghan society. So a lot of their allies were, they were basically known to be, like, they were very openly known to be, raping boys and things like that. And this wasn't a one-off case. This happened in quite a few places and happened for a number of years. So the whole contrast between PR and reality on the ground, the contradictions of the American strategy itself, they were never quite sure if they were nation building or if they were, there to punish Al-Qaeda. All of that combined to make a very incoherent strategy, and a strategy that wasn't going to work.
Sami, I want to pick up on that point that Ibrahim made about the incoherence of American policy in Afghanistan. I mean, Joe Biden admitted this in the most recent speech to the American public, that for probably 10 years, the Americans had realized that the adventure in Afghanistan was full of folly. It was a failed mission. But for whatever reason, the American presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and to the very end at least, stuck with the course and remained in Afghanistan. What accounts for that failure? I mean, I was reading George Packer's biography of Richard Holbrooke, who was the American attaché to Afghanistan, and as far back as 2009, he was telling Hillary Clinton that the mission was useless. The mission had failed, and America had to find a way out of Afghanistan because it's not working. What accounts for that incoherence that that high-level officials, generals on the field, diplomats were telling the American government that things were not going well and there needs to be an exit plan. Yet it took them 10 years to leave the country.
I was once invited to a closed-door discussion. It was organized by one of the major think tanks in Italy, and the US Department of Defense and a few of the Gulf states, they participate. Don't ask how I was invited. But there was one of the most senior US generals based in the Middle East there, based in the command center in Kuwait. And he was asked the question, at the time Trump was in power, this is 2018, and he was asked why America, if it knows even by his own assessment that it's a futile exercise, whether that's in Iraq, whether that's in Afghanistan, why do US troops stay there? And he responded quite remarkably, and he said, because of politics. And when they asked what he meant, he said, no US president is brave enough to take the political hit that will come as a result of withdrawing from Iraq or Afghanistan. The Democrats don't want the Republicans to do it, and the Republicans want the Democrats to do it, because neither party wants to be the one remembered for being in power at the time of America being humbled on the international stage, or on, as we're seeing Biden today, in the sense we're talking about the American forces being humbled and America in decline, and the post-Pax Americana and that kind of attitude. He said nobody wants to do it, and he actually said that's one of the good things that Trump is doing, in the sense that Trump, for all his disagreements, he's sitting down and he's saying, guys, we're not staying in Afghanistan, we're leaving. And he pulled the rug from under Ghani's government and said to him, listen, I don't care what you think, I'm making a deal with the Taliban and I'm leaving. And I think that's one of the interesting things, that even when we look back at the reign of Sheikh Burak Hussein Bouamama, when he came to power in Washington, he talked about withdrawing from Afghanistan, withdrawing from Iraq and the like. Don't forget the Arab Spring took place in 2011, 3 years into his rule, and Mohammed bin Zayed is telling him that your lack of support for Hosni Mubarak and bin Ali is a sign for all of us that you Americans can no longer be trusted. And Obama is sort of caught between, well, what am I supposed to do? I've got the security interests here, but I've got people protesting and overthrowing the regimes. I'm seeing people I don't want win elections, but on the public, I'm telling people that we should be pro-democracy. I've got France telling me that what's happening in Tunisia and Libya is a disaster. I've got this isn't the time for me to withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq at the time in which I need to assert power. And I think it's only when Donald Trump comes, the sort of outsider, the sort of anti, and I'm not praising Donald Trump. I believe he's one of the worst ever to come into Washington. But it's only when somebody with, I don't know what's the right word for it. Is it the complacency or the stubbornness or the contrarianism that's in Donald Trump? I don't want to say stupidity, but it's only when somebody comes like Donald Trump, who perhaps doesn't grasp the full concept of Pax Americana in the world, when he comes in and says, listen, oh, you guys want me to stay in Afghanistan? I'm leaving. You want me to stay in Iraq? I'm leaving. You want me to make a deal with Iran? I'm going to apply maximum pressure. In other words, he goes against everything that his advisors are telling him. And I think that's the simple answer. It was far too costly. Obama didn't want to go down in history as the man to withdraw Afghanistan. And I actually think, and it's a controversial opinion, because it's not that I am praising the occupier or the oppressor or the invader, but there is much to be said about Biden, that he can stand in front of the American public and American cameras with a straight face and tell them, I'm getting out and I don't care what you think about it. The idea that he can sit on a podium and say, guys, how many more soldiers do you want me to send to Afghanistan to get killed? The way that he can stand in front of the American public and do what Obama was terrified to do, what Bush was terrified to do, what Trump, I won't say he was terrified to do, but sort of, it's unclear whether he would have seen it to the end. But he liked the idea, but of course the implementation might have been different. But that's something that I think, contrary to people saying Biden is weak, I actually think Biden looks actually very strong in terms of how he's coming across, even if perhaps it does affect America's standing in the world. So that's the simple answer. The political hit, Biden believes he can take it. And I actually think the Americans don't care too much anymore about Afghanistan. The wave of revenge, the wave of wanting blood is long gone. The Americans are no longer in a hysteria, whereas before it was like punish and draw some blood and get revenge. Now it's more like, for God's sake, just the world hates us, let's bring our troops home and forget about it. But the only caveat I'll say, this is not to suggest Biden is different from his predecessors. And I think the glaring proof of this is that Biden punished the killing of 12 Marines by a drone strike that killed Afghan children. So the attitudes in many ways are the same. The only thing perhaps that is different is the American attitudes, i.e. revenge, and also the fact that Biden believes that there are far more greater priorities and he will not suffer the political hit in the manner Obama might have.
I mean, do you think that the change in American public opinion accounts for Donald Trump's capitulation in 2018 when he began negotiations with the Taliban, and Biden's complacency, I suppose, when he, regardless of the backlash in the American elite circles, in the Washington bubble, Biden is fairly confident, I suppose, that American public opinion is with him. Do you think that accounts a lot for this measure, whereas Obama was much more wary of the discontent that may arise out of leaving Afghanistan?
I think it's not necessary that Biden is less interested. More, I think Biden operates in an environment that was not afforded to Obama. Obama operated at a time in which he would have been hit badly and the Democrats would have been hit badly if he had withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan and the Taliban had come back to power, and then the Arab Spring would have taken place 2-3 years later. There would have been Ikhwan in Egypt and Ikhwan in Tunisia, and then it would have been chaos. America would have been all over the place. So I think with regards to Biden, it's not necessarily that the American public opinion has changed, but not in a manner in which they're suddenly against Afghanistan. More that it's no longer a priority and Biden can afford to take that political hit. But on your point about Trump capitulation, I don't think Trump sees it as capitulation. Trump, which is actually quite interesting in that a lot of Arab dads, I don't mean it in a derogatory term, I mean the older generation, when they see Trump's interviews, or when you see their Facebook and they're sharing Trump interviews of why did we go into Kuwait? Why did we go into Iraq? Why did we go into Afghanistan? It was stupid. We didn't. Everybody shares it. They see Trump as this, anti-American. They almost see Trump as if, he is the enemy of America who came and stuff. So while you say, Trump capitulated, there is this idea that Trump is not American for him to capitulate. Trump was this sort of, Allah sent him specifically to, do what the Americans didn't want to do, if that makes sense.
It does. And Ibrahim, I want to bring you in here. And can you shed some light on how America fought this conflict and why the tactics they employed created that anti-Americanism, that anti-American feeling that exacerbated the support for the Taliban?
So when they originally ousted the Taliban, it took them, it took them a month or two to get them out. And what they basically did was they sort of bombarded them into surrendering. The Taliban didn't have a sophisticated air defense or whatever. The problem after that was that, in their hunt for Al-Qaeda, which was driven to a large extent by this sort of irrational feeling of, revenge and sort of, stamping ourselves in the world, making an example. In that hunt for Al-Qaeda, they basically, they employed such a big dragnet. They made it basically impossible for the government of Hamid Karzai, which was not unwilling to negotiate with the Taliban, but they basically made it impossible for them to, sort of reach any sort of negotiations with the Taliban or to reach any sort of rapprochement with the Taliban. And the ironic thing is that in the winter of 2001 to 2002, both Hamid Karzai and even Musharraf in Pakistan, they were both very much in favor of basically giving amnesty or whatever to the Taliban in order that the new government could sort of stabilize. So Karzai had at least 2 or 3 attempts at making deals. One was with the central Taliban leadership in Kandahar, who basically they were the ones who approached him and they asked him, can you give us an amnesty and we'll just go back home, we'll retire, whatever. And then there was other, with sort of like seasoned sort of militant leaders such as Jalaluddin Haqqani, people like that, sort of further east, who they had friendly links with Al-Qaeda, but they were very much, pragmatic local politicians first and foremost. And somebody like Jalaluddin Haqqani, I've even, written articles about this, but, in his entire modus operandi was that he kind of made deals with everyone. He was sort of like a mediator. So even after the Taliban government fell, he was willing to make a deal with Karzai, who even offered his brother that he could make him a governor. But this was basically shot down by the United States. Rumsfeld basically, he wanted to, sort of punish everyone. They had this whole idea of, of a manhunt, and they made such a big dragnet. They not only involved Al-Qaeda people who they were trying to capture or kill. It involved basically Taliban, even Taliban foot soldiers, Taliban commanders, whatever. It involved other foreign fighters. There were a lot of, non-Al-Qaeda Arab foreign fighters. It even involved civilians. And, there's very famous cases of people in Guantanamo and who were basically, they were sort of swept up, sold there for bounty or whatever. So because of these sorts of things, it became impossible at that time to reach an agreement that would enable the Taliban to surrender peacefully. So of course they fought as a result of that. And the United States, there's sort of this myth that the United States they didn't pay enough attention to Afghanistan because they were distracted by Iraq. They definitely paid a lot of, they paid much more attention to Iraq, but they never really took their eye off Afghanistan. There were raids, there were missions by, commandos and things like that in the countryside. This is how the war was prosecuted until basically the late 2000s. The late 2000s, when the Taliban started making a comeback, the United States, them and NATO and, their allies, Canada, Britain, whatever, Germany, they started trying to implement the Iraqi strategy, which was, sort of like a nation building strategy. Basically, you go in, you have enough soldiers that you keep, the enemy away, and you try to build the conquered territory on your own terms. The problem with this was obviously that firstly the Americans couldn't stay there forever. Secondly, the Americans were not, obviously not being from Afghanistan, they had very little local knowledge. They were often fleeced by warlords or even by sort of scam artists, conmen, whatever you want to call it. And the third thing was that even this strategy, which had been tried in Iraq, it was sort of a band-aid strategy. It wasn't actual nation building. It was more of a political PR sort of thing. So you had basically warlords, you had criminals, you had these sorts of people who were often whitewashed as being what do you call it, developers and so almost like they were philanthropists when they were basically one side of a war. After the early 2000s, which was basically this period of the surge, the United States, they focused increasingly on basically their counterterrorism strategy that has since been employed, which is drone strikes, air strikes, things like that. They did kill quite a few senior Taliban and even Al-Qaeda people, but it was sort of like a whack-a-mole sort of thing. You kill one, another comes up. The Taliban was not such a centralized sort of organization that removing one or two leaders is going to make them collapse. They were very much ingrained in Afghan society, and there were a lot of Afghan groups, like I mentioned, who would often help the Taliban against their other rivals. But the United States has basically been applying this strategy. They've been trying to sort of Afghanize their mission, which of course the Soviets also tried to do by making an Afghan army. But the Afghan army was very, very dependent always on American airstrikes. And there's the militias that were supposedly the contrast to the Afghan army. They had a sort of rivalry with the army, and actually that's what we saw this summer. In some areas, the army just melted away. In other areas, the militias melted away. But they were more nervous about each other than they were about the Taliban. And there was very little coordination. And then finally, there's one more point that I'd like to bring up, which was that, for at least 10 years, the war has been privatized a lot. So there's been a lot more, contractors or mercenaries or whatever you want to call it, Eric Prince's people like that have been involved in Afghanistan, as opposed to American soldiers. And one of the reasons for this, obviously, because American soldiers getting killed makes it harder for the government to justify the war. You don't have that with professional mercenaries. The other thing is that it's obviously good for business. There's a lot of people such as Eric Prince who are, they make a lot of money out of this. And the third thing is it sort of enables you to use tactics that would be considered beyond the pale if your official army did it. So a lot of these mercenaries in Afghanistan, they were sort of kind of notorious. They were basically like warlords, except foreign warlords. So these are the different ways that the United States they basically went from long distance bombardment through to the surge, through to long distance bombardment and mercenaries. And none of these strategies really worked because their overall rationale for being in Afghanistan, it was never coherent. So the politics never matched up to the military planning.
Right, and I think that's a really good explanation. And you mentioned earlier the role of Pakistan in aiding the Taliban. What is the role of Pakistan? I mean, many commentators talk about Pakistan's dual role, or two faces when it comes to the conflict. On the one side, Pakistan supported the American mission, the NATO mission, with supply lines and territory as a way of prosecuting the conflict. But commentators also discuss that the ISI had nurtured elements of the Taliban and had very close connections with the Haqqani network and other elements of the Taliban. And ultimately, when the Qatar agreement was brokered, the news goes that Pakistan was quite instrumental in bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table. So how do you describe the complex relationship, I suppose, of Pakistan with the Taliban and with America? So
I'll just quickly just add some background history to this, just because it ties into this. So in the 1980s, Pakistan was the main, foreign state through which aid to the Mujahideen against the Soviets, distributed aid, weapons, things like that. So they were in alliance with the United States, but because the war was so important to American interests, the United States sort of generally let Pakistan get, do their thing. The Pakistani government of that time was was kind of guarded its privacy, its links with the Afghans very jealously. And the rationale in that war was, it was sort of similar to this one, in the sense that there was a foreign sort of behemoth that went into Afghanistan and had the potential to hurt Pakistan. The difference was that in the 1980s, Pakistan was allied with the United States in fighting such an invasion. In the 2000s, it was the opposite. They were aligned with the United States in the invasion, but this alliance was sort of forced upon them. It's important to remember that even Musharraf and even the Pakistani governments before him, they had links to varying Afghan parties, including some of the Taliban's enemies. But by the end of the 1990s, they were definitely very close to the Taliban. And even Musharraf, the first thing he did after 9/11, after the attacks, was that he tried to move Pakistan's relatively new nuclear assets, because he was afraid that this was a sort of a pretext for the United States to to spread the war into Pakistan and maybe strip them of their assets, especially the nuclear assets. So the nuclear thing it became a sort of form of leverage for Musharraf. But he was forced to support the United States because all the other countries in the region had already been on the opposite side, the side against Taliban, for a number of years. So Russia, India, Iran, a number of Central Asian countries had all been supporting the Taliban's enemies. And when 9/11 happened, it left not only the Taliban but also Pakistan exposed, because Pakistan had been backing the Taliban, who had been hosting Al-Qaeda. Even though Pakistan had been trying to wedge between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but they hadn't really been successful in that for a number of reasons. But what this forced Musharraf and subsequent Pakistani governments to do was sort of to apply a dual sort of policy. They kept the Taliban almost like insurance. They let them escape there. There was a lot of public support in Pakistan for the Taliban. Not just the military, but even among a lot of even rival political parties, things like that. Especially in the northwest of the country. At that time, there were a lot of sort of Islamic parties that were supporting the Taliban, basically under the table. And the government they looked the other way when this happened. So while Pakistan was doing this, they were also against Al-Qaeda, and their policy from the start, which the United States sort of rejected, was to focus on Al-Qaeda and basically leave the Taliban be. Like I mentioned, this was a policy that was even shared by Karzai at the time. He didn't want to make the Taliban into his enemies when he could have avoided it. But either way, Pakistan since that period has been, if not actively helping, at least tolerating the Taliban. It's been exaggerated quite a lot, in the sense that, for example, the United States sort of needed a scapegoat, so they blamed Pakistan. There was a lot of frustration. Definitely, Pakistan tolerated them being on its territory. They did extradite, or they did turn over a few Taliban officials at the start. Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, who was the ambassador, that's a very famous case, notorious case, where they basically turned him over to Guantanamo. But generally, after that, they sort of looked the other way. In some cases, parts of the Pakistani government or political parties or military helped the Taliban as far as logistics and things like that were concerned. So I personally know of a few very high ranked officers who were basically supporting the Taliban under the table, almost in their private capacity. So it was sort of a dual approach, in the sense that they were playing both sides off each other, but at the same time it was sort of vindicated in the sense that Pakistan's original policy, which was to oppose Al-Qaeda and to help the Taliban, that has sort of been that's sort of the policy towards which the United States has moved since then. And then the last thing I want to mention just quickly is the regional factor, which is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, basically Central Asia was up for grabs by the surrounding countries, including Pakistan, including India, including China, Russia, whatever. So, in fact, one of the reasons that Pakistan helped the Taliban was in the 1990s was because they had enough stability for Pakistani, merchants and traders to basically go through Afghanistan. The previous Afghan factions and governments were not able to do that. Basically, what happened in 9/11 was that the Pakistani side of this was basically sort of vilified, turned into a pariah. So the United States basically supported all the rivals of Pakistan. So that was another sort of incentive for Pakistan to sort of double deal with the United States. So what the United States basically did was they replaced Russia as the major power in the region. And this was also a factor that was in the minds of a lot of American policymakers, sort of exploit 9/11 to the effect that America becomes the new kingmaker in the region, which is obviously a very strategic region. India, which is Pakistan's major arch rival, was also very influential, sort of in egging the United States on to stay in Afghanistan. And even now, if you look at the reaction to the American defeat, I think the Indian government is probably the most dismayed at how things have gone, probably even more than the American government itself, because they sort of assumed that the Americans would be there forever. So they almost it was like betting on the wrong horse. And of course, India also wanted the United States to expand this anti-terrorism war into Pakistan. So they used to cite the links between the Pakistan military or government and between the Taliban. They used to sort of play it up, and they were basically very active in sort of creating this sort of political atmosphere where the war in Afghanistan was seen as between good and evil, with evil being radical jihadi Islamic terrorists or whatever. And obviously in Afghanistan the actual picture was much more complicated. But anyway, these are all the factors that sort of meant that Pakistan, even if they had wanted to, which I don't think they had, but they never abandoned the Taliban to the extent of rooting them out the way that the Americans would have preferred that they did. And that basically gave the Taliban a fallback area from where to operate, basically in western Pakistan, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Sami, it's fair to say that there is a context here which goes beyond the region. And that context is America's growing concern with China, concern about the rise of China. I mean, Donald Trump talked about the heedless, the failure of American strategy in focusing on the Muslim world and the Middle East when it should have been focusing on a great power rival, China. Joe Biden, in all of his speeches, makes reference to greater challenges America faces. Why are we squandering our wealth and our money and our people in Afghanistan when we've got bigger fish to fry? Do you buy that argument that one of the reasons behind the withdrawal was America's refocus, its need to think about the rise of China and to counter and to contain China? And I suppose the next question is, how does China view what is happening in Afghanistan and the potential relationship it may have or may not have with the new Afghan Taliban government?
I think that's a tricky question. I think first and foremost, because if we're looking at it from the China angle, the reality is that Afghanistan is an essential geostrategic country when it comes to pushing back against China. So if you're looking at Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan within the context of pushing back against China, then it doesn't really make that much sense, given that now you've just handed Afghanistan over to the Chinese, and there are all these statements that are being attributed to the Taliban, this idea that they have agreements now that China is going to rebuild Afghanistan, China is going to come in and give us the support that we need, and China is going to come in and help us on the international stage. So in many ways, if you're looking at it through the China angle, Biden has just handed over Afghanistan to the Chinese. So I don't think it's entirely driven by that particular framework. I think, moreover, when you've withdrawn from Afghanistan in a manner that affects India, which is one of your prime partners, in a way that vindicates Pakistan, and you're not taking steps to repair your ties with Pakistan, which has the attempts to be a potential game changer, but instead you're trying to back Turkey to get involved in Afghanistan in a bid to sort of drive a wedge between Turkey and Pakistan, or between Turkey and the Taliban, for example, which it bewilders me how Erdogan is going down that particular path, but that's a different issue altogether. The context of China doesn't entirely explain what is happening with regards to Afghanistan. It's true that there is a pivot to China. There is a map that's doing the rounds on social media about the extent to which over the past 20 years, how global trade has moved towards China. And there's this map now where it shows, I think in the 1980, majority of countries, US was the top trading partner. In 2021, China now is the top trading partner for most of the countries around the world. So I think there is much with regards to this extent. And perhaps Biden might have thought that there needs to be a different approach, a more diplomatic approach where they're dealing with Afghanistan. The one argument I would make that might fit with the China dynamic with regards to Afghanistan is perhaps this belief that the Americans believe they can actually develop a relationship with the Taliban, that if the Taliban have to choose between China and the US, they would still be more amenable to the US, that the US is still the only country that can give the international recognition to the Taliban that the Taliban so badly want. And the reality is that, let's be honest, even Pakistan is not recognizing the Taliban or giving it that international recognition until it sees it can do so without incurring consequences from Washington. Qatar, which is the party that mediated and that is talking to the Taliban, refuses to acknowledge the Taliban openly or give it international recognition until Biden is willing to do so. Turkey, likewise, is in the same position, as are Europe. In other words, it's absolutely clear that while the US have been defeated in Afghanistan, while they've withdrawn from Afghanistan, US still has options. Biden still has options in terms of how he can approach Afghanistan. And I actually think Erdogan, in his bid for the airport, has actually exposed two fundamental concerns within the Taliban. And you know, it's one of the reasons why perhaps many are upset about Turkey's approach towards Afghanistan. In insisting on the airport, Turkey has exposed two very important concerns. The first is that Taliban are worried about the internal backlash if they allow any foreign presence, and that includes the presence of Turkish troops, because Erdogan is insisting that if he's going to look after the airport, Erdogan is saying, I have to send my troops. The Taliban are saying, send us technical staff to train us. Turkey is saying, no, I have to send my troops. And part of that, of course, is because Erdogan is pitching to Biden and NATO on the other side that, you know, I can be your representative in Afghanistan. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. So Erdogan has exposed the Taliban fears about its internal dynamics. The second fear that Erdogan has exposed is the fear that instead of being recognized, Taliban might find themselves a pariah state and possibly even under sanctions and treated like Iran. And by that I mean the Taliban willingness to allow Turkey to look after the airport, but under a private company, shows that the Taliban are willing to make those concessions at the risk of their own gains internally, at the risk of their own internal unity, because they so badly want the international recognition that China and Russia quite simply cannot give them. Only the US can give them. And that's why when we're looking at it from the China dynamic, it is from this angle that perhaps it makes sense. This idea that Biden says, okay, the military approach didn't work, the occupying approach didn't work. Why don't we approach it from the way that we do in the Middle East, which is that we recognize power. We recognize Haftar in Libya because he's strong. We recognize Sisi's coup because Sisi's strong. We recognize bin Salman in Saudi because he's strong. We recognize Mohammed bin Zayed because he's strong. We recognize the militias in Iraq, and now we're negotiating with Iran, who are their sponsors, because they're strong. Why are we lying to ourselves about this idea of human rights and democracy? Let's approach it from the same realpolitik, pragmatic approach that we've approached it before, which is that yes, the Taliban we might have failed to get rid of the Taliban, but they still need us and we still have cards to play. And it may well be in that, yes, there's a shift towards China, and this would explain why perhaps Biden has withdrawn from Afghanistan in this manner. But my response does suggest that it's still up in the air.
Is this a different Taliban to the Taliban we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s? The Taliban that are more ready to show a diplomatic offensive, to be more conciliatory towards the Americans. The CIA director, William Burns, was in Kabul meeting with the political office of the Taliban, and the discussion was most probably about the airport, but you know, it doesn't preclude that other discussions were held with the Taliban, right? And so do we see a more savvy Taliban, but a Taliban that's more willing to work with the international community in exchange for what has been mentioned there by Sami, in exchange for international recognition and the aid and the trade that comes with that?
I think there's two ways of answering this. In one sense, you could say it is different in the sense that they're more politically savvy, or more aware of, more sensitive to international priorities, whether that's fighting terrorism or whether that's human rights, things like that. In another sense, though, you have to remember, even in the 1990s, they were trying to get international recognition. They maybe didn't place as much importance on it. But the fact that they were isolated was more because of the international community's opposition to them, whether that was because their opponents were recognized or just because of opposition to their policies. But so this need for international recognition has always been there, and like Sami says, actually it is a chip that the United States could exploit, because even now I don't think China and Russia can kind of bequeath that sort of recognition in the same way that even a declining America can. But the other thing I was saying was that that there is definitely more political savvy by the Taliban. They've put a lot more emphasis on diplomacy. Even with whether that's inside Afghanistan with their former opponents there, or whether that's with countries like China or Iran. Iran, which used to be a very big enemy of the Taliban, but at least for the last 5 years, they've been working with them to some extent. I think Pakistan, like Sami I think mentioned, but Pakistan played a role, or I think it was you who mentioned it, but Pakistan played a role in sort of helping bring the Taliban to the table. I think actually Pakistan's preference is that that the Taliban sort of stay in or join the Chinese sort of sphere of influence. One of the reasons being obviously that the United States is still very close with India. The other reason being that obviously China is next door. You can't you can't make it go away basically in the way that you could perhaps with the United States. So there is more of a diplomatic offensive by the Taliban in the last few years, but at the moment its success is still somewhat limited because the United States doesn't recognize them. China, Russia, even Pakistan don't recognize them yet. So it is sort of like a case of people waiting to see what happens, and whoever takes the plunge first, maybe that'll start a process of different countries recognizing them. But at the moment, their diplomacy it's worked only up to a certain point. They still have a long way to go in that respect.
In the remainder of the time we have left, I would like your thoughts, the two of you, on the state of the Muslim world as it stands. I mean, we've had a tumultuous 10 years or so, 20 years, but 10 years since the Arab Spring began, and we now have a Muslim world which is firmly in the grip of the authoritarians. We can't even think of it's impossible to cite an example now of most of the Arab countries, all of the Arab countries, where there's some form of representative government. And this decline, you suggest, Sami, it's no coincidence that the Americans have turned a blind eye to those authoritarians and those dictators. Now, one version of the Biden presidency, or one interpretation of the Biden presidency, was that he was going to take some of these authoritarians to task. I mean, for example, his refusal to deal with Mohammed bin Salman and to only speak to his father was seen symbolically, at least, to be Biden's aversion to human rights abusers and his requirement to reset some of those relationships on a more ideological platform where these countries are adherent to some of the principles that America would like to solidify in the world. I mean, to what extent has American policy changed with the change of leadership towards these Muslim leaders?
I think that's a grand question. I think that we have to put things into a wider context in order to look at where we are now. And I don't mean a history lesson, it's just a couple of sentences, which is that if you look about 80 years ago, the region was under official colonization. The French were officially in Algeria. The Italians were officially in Libya. The British were officially in Egypt. It was official colonization. That was the way that the world worked. And then we had what I call unofficial colonization. A series of independence movements took place. The economies are dominated by colonial powers, but they can no longer officially colonize these countries. There's been a shift. There's been a change. You can no longer go in and claim the territory for your own. You're forced by the geopolitical dynamics to put up some sort of pretense, either by supporting an autocrat or supporting an authoritarian. And that is a progress. And then you fast forward, of course, and then you have the Arab Spring, which takes place. You have people taken to the streets who are demanding freedom, demanding expression, demanding the right to employment, the right to healthcare, all the basic rights that are integral for any human being. So, and that's perhaps the greatest challenge to the authoritarian regimes, so much so that it undermined the US ability or the US relationship with these authoritarian regimes, so much so that Obama writes in his book that Mohammed bin Zayed says to him in 2011 that we can no longer trust the US and we'll be looking for alternative partners because you're not bailing on us, because you're not backing us. So in other words, it's clear that if you look a bit wider, rather than a decline, I actually think that we're progressing and we're actually going forward for all of the woes and for all of the troubles that are taking place. America has now retreated from Afghanistan. We're now in a multipolar world. There's Russia, there's China and the like. If you're talking about the Muslim world specifically, the reality is that it's becoming abundantly clear that the current series of systems doesn't work and that the people will no longer tolerate it. And now we're entering a crossroads whereby the choice is, do the authoritarians continue to rule by repression, oppression, and fighting insurgencies day and night across the region and have no peace? Or do we decide to move forward as an international community in order to try to find some way within which at least to give piecemeal initiatives to the people? And by that, I don't mean the international community gives it willingly. I mean by the way the dynamics change from official colonization to unofficial colonization to Arab Spring or the like. It's clear that as people push, the things are changing. But as you say, there's still a long way to go, primarily because the reaction to the Arab Spring was one of hesitation on the part of the international community. This idea that when we tried to give them democracy, they voted for the wrong choice. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, in an interview with Le Grand Continent in November 2020, he says it quite bluntly. He says, what we noticed from the Arab Spring is that the people in the region voted for regression and backwardness. They voted, in other words, that their free democratic vote for Mohammed Morsi or for Al-Nahda or for Ali al-Sha'biyya or for these other Islamic-leaning parties was a vote for regression. So you can see the attitudes. In this roundtable that I mentioned earlier, there was an EU diplomat who remarked when it was said to him, why didn't you support the democratic transition in Egypt and prevent Sisi's coup? He said, Morsi came to Europe and sat and said, I am the majority. And somebody replied and said, well, he was the majority. Yes, but that's not how he should be acting. But that's how every leader in the Western world acts. He's the leader who won the democratic majority. He's entitled to rule for 4 years and then he's voted out or he's voted in again. In other words, it's clear that we're entering this stage whereby after we kicked out colonization, after we threatened the colonial grip on the economies, after the international community was forced to give the people of the region the chance to freely vote for who they wanted, we're at a stage where the international community is sort of saying, do we want to live with this? And that's where I think the debate has moved on, this idea of, okay, this is the reality. 80 years of secular social engineering, whether it's by Bourguiba, whether it's by Ben Ali, whether it's by the other leaders in the region forcefully trying to change the identities of the state, and it hasn't worked. Ben Ali fell, and all of a sudden people are still voting for bearded men who say Allahu Akbar and hold the Quran. I remember in 2013 I was in Egypt during the presidential elections. I went to a countryside in Sohag and I asked somebody, who are you voting for? He said, I'm voting for Morsi. I said, but what is it about his political program that pleases you, about his economic policies? He said, Wallahi, I don't care about the political program. I said, what do you mean? How can you vote for somebody if you don't know his political program? They said, I want somebody who fears Allah. I said, but there should be more than. He goes, no, if he fears Allah, Allah will make everything easy for him. This idea that the identity, the Islamic identity still plays such a powerful role in the political decision-making and the political perceptions of the ordinary person in the region. And that's why I think rather than a decline, we're actually now towards a stage whereby we're getting towards a crossroads in which you have a new generation, second generation, third generation Muslims, grew up in the West, understand the systems, understand how they work, looking at the Muslim world, how they believe it should be changed, how it can work, going back, taking their expertise, taking their talents. You look at Turkey, Erdogan as an example, even if he's not the ideal example, but Erdogan, this idea of establishing a Turkish agency that allows him to at least stand up in some cases to the Americans, to the Russians. You'll remember how Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo and Gina Haspel, when Erdogan threatened to go into northern Syria, they flew out immediately. They scrambled to Ankara to meet Erdogan and tell him, okay, what is it that you want? Something that perhaps we haven't seen in a long time in terms of the region. So I think we are going towards agency. The world order is not the way that it was before. It's becoming increasingly multipolar. This doesn't mean that it's getting better, but it means that opportunities that weren't there before are now afforded to us. Opportunities that didn't exist before as a result of the tight chokehold that the authoritarian regimes had on the region. These chokeholds are now not as strong as they used to be. So in terms of the reality is that the dynamics are changing, things are changing. It doesn't necessarily mean things are going to get better, but it does certainly mean that the debate is now moving to a stage of increasing frankness, of increasing discussions. And I think Afghanistan is actually a very good example of this, in that today you have this sort of battle of narratives. You have a narrative which says that the Taliban are a terrorist organization, pro-Al-Qaeda, the backward people, etc. But you have an equally powerful narrative on the other side, which is that, listen, it was an illegal invasion, Taliban should be given a chance, they should be worked with, etc. And that's the age of social media. And that's why I often remark that, a family member of mine often remarks that may Allah bless Mark Zuckerberg for bringing us Facebook and social media that allows us to bypass the mainstream media, allows us to bring out these narratives. And the last example I'll give on this point is the last Israeli-Palestinian war. This idea that for the first time, Israel's grip on the narrative was broken by Palestinian activism on social media. For the first time, the word apartheid was used in Congress. For the first time, the suggestion of sanctions of Israel was posed in Congress. And this is the reality. This never used to happen before. This was unthinkable before. It's clear things are moving. It may not be the way that we want it. We may not have arrived at their goal. It may be we go our whole lives and it doesn't turn out the way that we want to. But certainly, in my opinion, over the last 70 years, the trajectory is certainly very positive in a very twisted way, if that makes sense.
Ibrahim Moiz, Sami Hamdi, it's been a fascinating discussion. And as the sun declines here in Istanbul, I think we can leave on an optimistic note, inshallah ta'ala. And I thank you for your contributions today.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with Ibrahim as well.
Thanks very much. It was a very good discussion. Assalamu alaikum.